In this lecture, we'll be examining early French efforts to tap into emerging global trade networks in the 17th century. The French had a somewhat later start than some of their European rivals in overseas trade due to dynastic conflict and internal disunity in the 16th century. As we examine the history of the French and their efforts to expand in the East, consider how French efforts compared with Portuguese, Dutch, and English overseas activities. In earlier lectures, we have examined the state monopolies of the Portuguese and Spanish, along with the early capitalist structures of the British and Dutch East India Companies. While in North America, the French relied principally on settler colonialism and missionary activity to develop their colonial holdings. With regard to trade in Asia and Africa, the French attempted to develop models similar to the English and the Dutch with the development of corporate trade enterprises. By the 17th century, the French wars of religion had subsided, and the French were eager to tap into the Indian Ocean trade networks already being exploited by other European powers. In 1600, the Compagnie de Orientales was founded by French merchants in the towns of Saint-Malo, Laval, and Vitre, which I've outlined in red on this map. The name translates as Company of the Eastern Seas. The company sent 2 ships to the East Indies, but ultimately this was an unsuccessful venture, and most of the capital pool was lost in this expedition. In 1604, the French king Henry IV issued letters of patent to the Société pour le voyage des Indes Orientales. The company hired former VOC employees Peter Linkins and Gerard Leroy. This was yet another French failure due to a lack of willing investors, heavy English and Dutch opposition, plus the traditional French focus on continental affairs. In 1619, the French crown gave a charter privilege to a Compagnie de Moluques, or this Molucan company, which received a 12-year monopoly for Spice Islands trade. This venture too was another failure for the French. The initial voyage sailed from Honfleur in northern France, which you can see on this map. It consisted of only 2 ships, one of which would later be captured by the Dutch in Java. The heavy financial losses of this expedition, coupled with the expenses associated with the 30 Years' War, dampened French enthusiasm for Asian trade for well over a decade. French Minister Cardinal Richelieu restarted efforts by France to enter Asian trade networks. The Société sent ships to Asia in 1633 to 1637 from the northern French port of Dieppe, D-I-E-P-P-E. Letters patent were also issued to a French Compagnie d'Orient, but the company bankrupted after a failed attempt to colonize the island of Madagascar. In 1660, the China Company was formed. It was modeled after the Dutch VOC, but it had the purpose of transporting missionaries to Asia and profiting from the transport trade. The first ship was unseaworthy, however, and the company folded after a brief period. There were a number of reasons for early French failures in expanding in the Indian Ocean trade network. The internal political and religious problems of the French kingdom took precedence over trade expansion. The French also, again, had a traditional focus on continental and dynastic issues that tended to monopolize royal attention. There was a significant lack of private investment in overseas trade efforts by French merchants and French bankers, who tended to take a more regional view for their investments. Finally, the French faced Portuguese, English, and Dutch rivals who were already entrenched in Asia and who aggressively targeted new arrivals in the Indian Ocean trade networks. One individual was almost single-handedly responsible for the newest French efforts to expand their presence in Asian trade networks. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the French finance minister from 1665 to 1683. Colbert also served Louis XIV as the Minister of Navy, the Minister of Commerce, the Minister of Colonies, and the Minister of Buildings. He improved the French balance of trade and led efforts to improve tax collection and reduce corruption in French government. Colbert was a mercantilist in terms of economic philosophy. Mercantilism is an economic belief that a nation's wealth is best measured by its supply of capital. Mercantilists believe that global trade is finite, so a nation needs to get a bigger slice of the proverbial pie to increase national wealth. Taking from someone is the only way that you can gain. Mercantilists thus advocated government policies that encouraged exports and inhibited imports. The French East India Company, or Compagnie de Indes Orientales, was formed by Colbert, and it had an initial investment pool of 6 million livres that was quickly raised to 15 million livres. The French King Louis XIV invested 3 million livres from the royal treasury in the initial stock purchases. The company received a 50-year monopoly that stretched from the Cape of Good Hope at southern Africa to the Straits of Magellan at the southern tip of South America, as well as a perpetual concession for the island of Madagascar, which the French called Île Dauphine. However, most investment in the company was by royal officials and courtiers, along with the French king. There was a marked indifference to purchase company stock by the urban bourgeoisie and merchant class in France, and this essentially became a company largely owned by the French crown and the royal court. There were a number of reasons for the formation of this new overseas trade company. Colbert saw Dutch trade as a potential Achilles heel in the conflict between the French and the Dutch. As a mercantilist, Colbert naturally believed the only way to improve French wealth was to take it from another country. Louis XIV's desire for gloire at home and abroad was an important factor, as was the desire for profits. Louis XIV is depicted on this slide. Finally, missionary zeal and the desire to spread Christianity also factored into the equation. To lead the new company, François Caron was hired in 1665 by Colbert. Caron was an ex-Dutch East India Company official who had familiarity with Asian trade networks. His plan was somewhat simple. He wanted to exploit anti-VOC hostilities by Asian rulers. He planned to offer French assistance to local rulers against the Dutch in exchange for trade deals. Caron planned to build a series of entrepôts and emphasize the country trade to maximize French profits. However, Caron knew the South China Sea trade much better than the Indian Ocean trade that the French were primarily interested in. Blanquet de la Haye was a French admiral and experienced military veteran who was named governor and lieutenant general for French activities in the Indian Ocean basin. Louis XIV gave Admiral de la Haye the power to appoint governors in any regions he conquered, and promised that he could take the title of viceroy after establishing a permanent base in the east. The French faced a number of challenges in their new efforts to tap into Asian trade networks. There was a lack of experienced personnel in the new French company, and the French also faced problems with epidemic disease and provisioning issues, resistance by European competitors, as well as the high cost of gifts to local rulers hampered French efforts. In addition, there were a number of personality clashes causing problems. For example, Caron fought with French church officials over the primacy of trade versus missionary efforts. Several company officials quickly recognized that Caron was kind of behind the times in his knowledge of the Indian Ocean basin, maybe as much as 15 years behind the times. Finally, Caron and La Haye were engaged in a power struggle over leadership of French efforts in India. The first French East India Company expedition was not especially successful. The 1665 fleet became mired in at Madagascar due to a late start, which also caused them to miss the monsoon sailing season, putting them behind a year. Protestants and Catholics on company ships clashed, and one ship was seized by privateers, English privateers. The company managed only a paltry first shipment of cheap textiles back to France, and this first expedition racked up huge losses. To back French East India Company efforts in the Indian Ocean basin, Colbert assembled a massive fleet known as the Persian Squadron. The fleet contained 9 ships, including 5 warships, and 2,100 men and about 238 cannon. The fleet's goal was to establish fortresses in Ceylon, in India, and Sumatra in the Spice Islands. In November 1670, Haye fought a really pointless and bloody war against indigenous peoples on the island of Madagascar, which cost him hundreds of men and many months of lost time. It also gave the European competitors a heads up that the French were coming. In October of 1671, the fleet arrived at Surat in India, and Haye named himself viceroy. In July 1672, Haye bombed and then captured the Portuguese enclave of São Tomé in eastern India. This is the modern Indian city of Chennai. This action alienated the English and Portuguese, and it led the king of Golconda in the Indian subcontinent to attack the French. The Dutch ended up finishing off Haye's forces in 1673 and 1674, and François Caron died at sea trying to escape what is rapidly becoming a debacle in India. There are many reasons why the French struggled at building a lasting presence in the Indian Ocean basin. The Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese possessed accurate intelligence about the French squadron and were ready for the fleet when it finally arrived. The French, meanwhile, had poor initial intelligence and severely underestimated the strength of European competitors in the Indian Ocean basin. Colbert, back in Paris, had rivals in the French court for political priorities, and this again reflected the continuing continental aims versus overseas goals. There were significant funding issues, as the French were simultaneously fighting a land war against the Dutch, so the Indian Ocean War and the Continental War against the Dutch. And due to these funding issues, there were no reinforcements for Haye after 1672. He had to fight with what little men he had remaining in ships. The militancy of the Dutch surprised the French as the VOC fought tenaciously against the French in India and Ceylon. Caron and Haye both made critical leadership mistakes, and there was poor communication between Surat, Fort Dauphin, and Colbert back in Paris. French merchants were inexperienced and really, frankly, inept in their early activity in India, paying way too much for some goods and not bringing enough bullion or trade goods to India that could assist them in their trade efforts. Local resistance to the French and a lack of respect for the French company interfered with progress. Moreover, in the late 17th century, there was a decided lack of a strong French capitalist class to fund overseas operations. Again, the French court and the French king provided almost all of the capital, and when they began to lose interest, the company really suffered for funding. Finally, the emphasis that Louis XIV placed on continental warfare in Europe meant that French expansion in India would be stalled until after the death of Louis XIV in 1713. This draws to a close our brief look at early French efforts at expansion of trade in the Indian Ocean basin.